There is a morning in September 1830 that divides history. Before it, the world moved at the speed of horses. After it, everything changed. The place is Liverpool. The sky hangs low and grey, pregnant with industrial smoke. Crowds press against wooden barriers, thousands of them, dressed in their Sunday finest though it is a Wednesday. They have come to witness something that many believe impossible, others dangerous, and a few prophetic. They have come to see the future move. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway is about to open. 31 miles of iron rail stretching across the Lancashire countryside, connecting two cities that had never been closer, yet never felt more distant. Cotton mills in Manchester hunger for raw materials from Liverpool's docks. Merchants in Liverpool thirst for finished goods from Manchester's factories. Between them lies bog and hill, canal and road, and the aching slowness of horse-drawn wagons that take a full day to make the journey. George Stephenson stands beside his locomotive, the Rocket. His hands, calloused from decades of working with coal and iron, rest gently on the warm metal. He is 59 years old, a man who learned to read at 18, who spent his youth as a colliery engineman in the darkness of Northumberland mines. Now he has built a machine that Parliament debated, that scientists ridiculed, that investors feared would bankrupt them all. The Rocket is not beautiful. It is functional, brutal even. A copper boiler sits atop a frame of iron, with pistons that drive wheels taller than a man. Coal smoke rises from its chimney. Water hisses from relief valves. The whole contraption seems to breathe, seems alive in a way that unnerves the horses tied nearby. They stamp and whinny, smelling something their instincts cannot name. At precisely 10:30, the Duke of Wellington climbs aboard one of 8 carriages coupled behind the locomotive. The Iron Duke, victor of Waterloo, now a guest of honour for a different kind of battle. Around him sit industrialists, members of Parliament, journalists with notebooks already filling with adjectives they hope will capture the impossible. Stephenson opens the regulator. Steam rushes into cylinders. Pistons begin their rhythmic dance, and slowly, impossibly, the train moves. There is no explosion, no catastrophe, no divine intervention to stop this affront to nature. The train simply begins to roll, gathering speed with each rotation of its great wheels. 5 miles per hour. Then 10, 15, 20. The crowd erupts. Some cheer. Others fall silent, struck dumb by what they witness. Children point and laugh. Old men weep, though they could not say why. The train passes them in a rush of wind and noise and coal smoke, and in that moment the 19th century truly begins. But there is blood on these rails already. William Huskisson, Member of Parliament for Liverpool, had stepped from his carriage during a brief stop at Parkside. The trains had paused to take on water, and Huskisson, ever the politician, spotted the Duke of Wellington in an adjacent carriage. He crossed the tracks to shake the Duke's hand, to mend a political rift that had grown between them. He did not see the Rocket approaching on the parallel track, or perhaps he saw it and misjudged its speed, conditioned by a lifetime of horses that could be stopped with a shout. The locomotive struck him, crushing his leg beneath its wheels. Huskisson died that evening in the vicar's house in Eccles, the first man in history to be killed by a passenger train. His blood soaked into the wooden floorboards while outside, church bells rang not in mourning, but in celebration of the railway's opening. This is the paradox at the heart of the railway age. Progress and death, intertwined like the rails themselves. The Liverpool and Manchester Railway is not the world's first. That distinction belongs to the Stockton and Darlington, opened 5 years earlier to haul coal from pit to port. But the Liverpool and Manchester is different. It carries passengers. It runs on schedule. It proves that railways can be profitable, reliable, transformative. Within months, the line is carrying thousands of passengers daily. Factory workers ride in open third-class carriages, exposed to rain and soot. Merchants travel in covered second-class compartments, seated on wooden benches. The wealthy recline in first-class coaches that mimic the stagecoaches they replace, complete with padded seats and oil lamps. The journey that once took a full day now takes 90 minutes. Letters that required a week now arrive the same afternoon. Fresh fish from Liverpool's docks reach Manchester tables before the smell of the sea has faded from their scales. But it is the psychological shift that proves most profound. For the first time in human history, ordinary people experience speed. Not the momentary rush of a galloping horse or a boat shooting rapids, but sustained, mechanical, unstoppable velocity. There are places where the earth refuses to yield. Box Tunnel on the Great Western Railway between Bath and Bristol is one such place. 2 miles of darkness through the limestone hills of Wiltshire. 2 miles that Isambard Kingdom, Brunel has promised Parliament he can bore through, despite the fact that no tunnel of such length has ever been attempted in Britain. Brunel is 30 years old, already famous for his Thames Tunnel, already notorious for his ambition. He stands at the western portal of Box Hill in the spring of 1836, a small man in a tall hat, cigar perpetually clamped between his teeth, sketching modifications to drilling equipment while around him 4,000 men prepare to attack the hill from both ends. The work begins with surveying shafts, 8 of them, sunk vertically through the hilltop to the level where the tunnel will run. Each shaft descends nearly 300 feet, through layers of limestone and clay, through underground springs that flood the workings, through stone so hard it breaks the picks of the strongest men. The navvies descend in buckets, swinging on ropes in the darkness, candles fixed to their hats with clay. At the bottom, they begin to dig horizontally, working in teams of 3. One man holds the drill, an iron bar 6 feet long. 2 others swing sledgehammers in alternating rhythm, striking the drill head, driving it inch by inch into the rock face. The sound is inhuman, metal on metal, echoing in the confined space until it becomes a physical thing, a force that enters through the ears and rattles the bones. The men work 15-minute shifts before their arms can no longer lift the hammers. Then they swap positions, the drill holder becoming a striker, one striker taking the drill, the other resting. When the hole is deep enough, they pack it with gunpowder, insert a fuse and retreat. The blast is deafening in the tunnel, a pressure wave that hammers the chest, that leaves ears ringing for hours. Smoke fills the narrow space, thick and choking. The men wait for it to clear, then return to shovel the broken rock into wheelbarrows to be hauled to the surface and dumped. They advance at most 8 feet per day, often less. Sometimes the rock is too hard, the powder too damp, the drill broken. There are days when the tunnel gains mere inches. And there are days when men die. John Griffin falls from a rope while being lowered into one of the shafts. His body strikes an outcropping 40 feet down, breaking his back. He lives for 6 hours at the bottom of the shaft, conscious, calling for his wife, before death finds him in the darkness. Thomas Dorr is crushed when a section of tunnel ceiling collapses, tons of limestone burying him so completely that his body is never recovered. His widow receives £5 compensation from the railway company and is asked to vacate her company-owned cottage within the week. Henry Clark suffocates when a blast detonates prematurely, filling the tunnel with smoke and coal gas. He is found at his work face, drill still clutched in his hands, face purple in the candlelight. The deaths are recorded in Brunel's journals, brief notations among calculations of angles and load-bearing capacities. Not callousness, perhaps, but the arithmetic of progress. The tunnel must be completed. The dead cannot stop the living from digging. By 1838, over 100 men have died in Box Tunnel. The local parish registers fill with the names of navvies, their ages, their injuries. Crushed by falling stone, drowned in flooded workings, killed by premature blast. The causes vary, but the result is the same. Widows, orphans, grave in the corner of the churchyard reserved for those who died far from home. The camp outside Box Village is a city of mud and canvas, home to 4,000 souls living in conditions that would shame a medieval army. Cholera sweeps through in the summer of 1839, killing 30 men in a week. Typhoid follows in the autumn. The company doctors do what they can, but they are outnumbered, undersupplied, exhausted by the endless parade of broken bodies and fevered brows. The navvies endure. They have no choice. The work pays well by the standards of the time, and there are families depending on those wages. Every Saturday, men line up outside the company office to receive their pay in coin, most of which will be spent by Monday on food, beer, and the company store that charges prices no villager would tolerate. There are moments of grace even in this hell. A fiddler plays Irish reels on Saturday nights, and men dance with each other in the firelight, laughing at their own ridiculousness. A Methodist preacher establishes a reading room in one of the larger huts, teaching navvies to write their names, to cipher numbers, to read scripture. Some embrace it, others mock it, but the preacher persists, believing that literacy might save these men's souls if nothing else can save their bodies. And slowly, impossibly, the tunnel grows. The railway fever that gripped Britain did not remain an island disease. It spread across the Channel like typhus, infecting nations with the promise of speed, profit, and modernity. France watched with mixture of envy and alarm as British trains carried passengers at 30 miles per hour, as British factories shipped goods overnight instead of over weeks, as British investors grew rich on railway dividends. In the salons of Paris, engineers and politicians debated whether France should follow Britain's chaotic private model or impose state planning on this new technology. They chose order. In 1842, the French government passed a law establishing a national railway plan. Lines would radiate from Paris like spokes from a wheel hub, connecting the capital to every corner of the nation. The state would own the land and infrastructure. Private companies would operate the trains. It was thoroughly French, this marriage of bureaucratic control and capitalist enterprise. The reality proved messier than the plans. The Paris to Rouen line, authorized in 1843, required crossing the Seine multiple times, boring through chalk hills, spanning valleys that were impassable in winter. French engineers, trained at the École Polytechnique, approached these challenges with mathematical precision. They calculated grades and curves, designed bridges and viaducts, specified every dimension of every structure. But theory ended where the earth began. France had no navvies, no army of experienced railway builders. They had to import them, mostly from Britain, men who spoke no French and cared little for Parisian precision. The French contractors watched in horror as these rough men attacked their carefully planned works with brutal efficiency, deviating from specifications when it suited them, trusting experience over calculation. There was wisdom in their roughness. A British navvy foreman named Jack Murphy redesigned a viaduct near Rouen, modifying the arch supports in ways that violated every principle his French supervisors held dear. The engineers protested to Paris. Murphy shrugged and continued building. When spring floods came, his viaduct stood while the engineer-designed bridge downstream collapsed into the river. The French learned, grudgingly, that building railways required more than mathematics. It required understanding soil and water, weather and stone, the infinite variables that no equation could capture. They began training their own railway workers, establishing camps along the construction routes, teaching French farm labourers the art of moving earth and laying track. These French workers approached the task differently than their British counterparts. They worked shorter hours, ate better food, and organized themselves into compagnonages, medieval guilds adapted to industrial purpose. They took pride in their craft, competed to see which team could lay the straightest section of track, the most perfect ballast bed. But they died just as easily. A blast gone wrong near Poissy killed 11 men in 1845. A scaffolding collapse at Mantes took 7 more. The mathematics of death remained constant across borders. By 1848, France had 800 miles of operational railway, connecting Paris to Orleans, to Rouen, to Strasbourg. The network was more orderly than Britain's, the stations grander, the timetables more reliable. French engineers published papers on optimal track gauge and bridge design, establishing standards that would influence railway building worldwide. But 800 miles was nothing compared to Germany. The German states, not yet unified, embraced railways with an enthusiasm that bordered on mania. Bavaria built lines to connect Munich with Stuttgart. Prussia pushed rails east toward Königsberg and west toward the Rhine. Saxony, Baden, Württemberg, each state competed to prove its modernity through miles of track. The landscape aided them. The North German plain was flat, easy to build across, forgiving of engineering errors. The Rhine and Elbe valleys provided natural corridors through the uplands. Where Britain required tunnels and cuttings, Germany often needed merely grading and ballast. But Germany's advantage was not merely geographic, it was human. The German states had Technische Hochschulen, technical universities, that had been training engineers for decades. They had precision manufacturing, clockmakers and gunsmiths who could fabricate locomotive parts to tolerances the British found astonishing. They had a cultural reverence for education and planning that made railway building a national project rather than merely a commercial venture. The Leipzig-Dresden line, opened in 1839, was the first long-distance railway in Germany. It ran through Saxon forests and across meadows where sheep had grazed for centuries. The local farmers watched its construction with suspicion, remembering the disruptions of the Napoleonic Wars, fearing that railways would bring only soldiers and taxation. America was too large for horses. This was the fundamental problem facing the young republic in 1840, a nation that stretched from Atlantic to Appalachian, with territories reaching toward the Mississippi and beyond, connected only by rutted roads, seasonal rivers, and coastal shipping. A letter from Boston to Charleston required 3 weeks. Goods from Pittsburgh to New Orleans traveled by flatboat, a journey of months. The Erie Canal, opened in 1825, had proven that artificial waterways could bind regions together, could turn New York into the nation's commercial capital. But canals froze in winter, required constant maintenance, and could only go where water would flow. Railways promised something different: all-weather transport, unlimited routing, speed that made the canal boats seem as slow as the stagecoaches they had replaced. The first American railways were short, tentative experiments. The Baltimore and Ohio, chartered in 1827, carried passengers a mere 13 miles to Ellicott's Mills. The Charleston and Hamburg, opened in 1833, ran 136 miles through South Carolina swamps, the longest railway in the world at that time, but an isolated line that connected to nothing. But by 1840, American ambition had grown to match the continent. Visionaries spoke of railways crossing the Appalachians, reaching the Mississippi, eventually spanning the entire distance to the Pacific Ocean. It was absurd, impossible, magnificent. It was also deeply American, this belief that engineering could conquer geography, that human will could reshape nature, that there was no distance too far, no mountain too high, no obstacle that couldn't be overcome with enough iron and determination. The technical challenges were immense. British railways ran through a landscape that humans had been modifying for millennia, where hills had been flattened and valleys filled, where stone was abundant and labor plentiful. America offered primeval forest, unbridged rivers, mountain ranges that dwarfed anything in Europe, and vast distances between settlements. American engineers adapted. They built lighter, cheaper railways than their European counterparts. Where British lines used heavy iron rails laid on stone blocks, Americans used lighter rails on wooden ties. Where European railways excavated deep cuttings and raised massive embankments to maintain level grades, Americans built tracks that followed terrain, accepting steeper grades in exchange for faster, cheaper construction. The results were sometimes spectacular, sometimes disastrous. American locomotives, designed to handle sharp curves and steep grades, became mechanical marvels of flexibility. But American tracks, built to lower standards, produced bone-jarring rides and frequent derailments. Passengers learned to brace themselves, To accept that railway travel in America meant discomfort, danger, and the constant possibility of catastrophe. None of this stopped the railway boom. By 1850, America had 9,000 miles of track, most of it in the northeastern states where capital and population were concentrated. Railway companies proliferated like mushrooms, each with its own gauge, its own equipment, its own ambitions. The Pennsylvania Railroad embodied those ambitions. Chartered in 1846 to connect Philadelphia with Pittsburgh, it faced the Allegheny Mountains, a barrier that had constrained westward commerce since colonial times. The Appalachian ridges rose 4,000 feet, too steep for conventional railways, too formidable to tunnel through with existing technology. The solution was audacious. The Pennsylvania Railroad would climb the eastern slope using a series of inclined planes, stationary steam engines that winched railcars up grades too steep for locomotives. At the summit, a portage railway would cross the ridge. On the western slope, more inclined planes would lower trains to the Pittsburgh Valley. It was insane. It was brilliant. It worked. The construction required 3,000 laborers, most of them Irish immigrants fleeing the famine that had devastated their homeland. They arrived in America with nothing but muscle and desperation, willing to work for wages that native-born Americans refused, willing to die in numbers that made even the railway companies uncomfortable. At Horseshoe Curve, where the railway climbed the eastern slope, the Irish crews blasted and pickaxed their way through solid rock, creating a massive semicircular cut that allowed the tracks to gain elevation while maintaining a grade that locomotives could manage. They worked through Pennsylvania winters, through blizzards that buried the camps, through cold that froze whiskey in the bottle and turned steel brittle. They died in numbers that the Pennsylvania Railroad never officially recorded. Falls from scaffolding, premature blasts, rock slides, hypothermia. The company buried them in unmarked grave along the right-of-way, paying their widows $10 and evict. The railway arrived in India on April 16, 1853, carrying 400 guests from Bombay to Thane, a distance of 21 miles through monsoon-soaked countryside that had known only bullock carts and river boats. The locomotive was named Sind, built in Britain and shipped in pieces around the Cape of Good Hope, reassembled by British engineers who sweltered in the heat and cursed the humidity that made their tools rust overnight. The carriages were first-class luxury, cushioned seats and silk curtains, designed to impress the Indian aristocracy and convince them that British technology was worth the enormous cost the railway would demand. Lord Dalhousie, Governor-General of India, had a vision. He saw railways spanning the subcontinent, connecting Calcutta to Bombay, Delhi to Madras, binding British India into an integrated colonial economy. Cotton and tea would flow to ports. Manufactured goods from Britain would flow inland. And most importantly, troops could be moved rapidly to suppress any rebellion in this vast, restive empire. The vision required money that India did not have and engineering expertise it could not provide. British investors supplied the capital, guaranteed by the colonial government at 5% interest. British engineers designed the routes. British manufacturers supplied the locomotives and rails, and Indian labor, conscripted or desperate, did the actual building. They called them coolies, a term that stripped dignity from men doing impossible work for wages that barely sustained life. They came from every corner of India, speaking dozens of languages, following contractors who promised work and delivered only hardship. The construction of the Great Indian Peninsula Railway from Bombay into the Deccan Plateau required crossing the Western Ghats, a mountain range that rose 4,000 feet in less than 50 miles. The British engineers proposed a route that would climb via reversing stations, switchbacks where trains had to stop and reverse direction to continue ascending. The work was brutal. The monsoon season turned the construction sites into quagmires where mud swallowed tools and men alike. The dry season brought heat that killed workers from heatstroke, that made steel too hot to touch, that dried water supplies to trickles. Disease was constant. Cholera swept through the labor camps. Malaria killed men in their sleep. Dysentery weakened everyone. The British engineers lived in bungalows with punkahs and servants, insulated from the worst of the heat and disease. They drew salaries that would have kept an Indian family comfortable for years. When they died, from disease or accident, their bodies were shipped home to England and buried with full honours. The Indian workers lived in temporary shelters, canvas tents or bamboo huts that provided minimal protection from weather. They drew wages of 4 annas per day, barely enough for rice and dehal. When they died, their bodies were burned on communal pyres or buried in unmarked grave along the railway line. No one counted the dead. The company kept records of European casualties with meticulous care. Indian deaths were noted only when they disrupted work schedules or required hiring replacements. Later historians would estimate that building India's railways killed over 1 million workers across 6 decades of construction, but the true number will never be known. What was built justified the cost, the British claimed. By 1870, India had 4,000 miles of railway, connecting the major cities, linking inland regions to ports, enabling the movement of goods and troops with unprecedented speed. There is something about night travel that reveals truth. By 1870, railways had become ordinary, mundane even. The shock and wonder of the 1830s had faded. People boarded trains without ceremony, read newspapers as countryside blurred past, arrived at destinations with barely a thought for the marvel of their journey. But night changed everything. Night made the railway strange again. Consider the overnight express from London to Edinburgh, introduced in 1873. It departed Euston Station at 8 in the evening, when the city's gas lamps were being lit and theatres were beginning their performances. It arrived in Edinburgh at 7 the next morning, having covered 400 miles while passengers slept, having crossed from England into Scotland, having traversed the border that had once meant days of dangerous travel. The experience was surreal. Passengers boarded in one world and awoke in another, with no memory of the transition, no sense of the journey, only the evidence of arrival. It was the first time in human history that ordinary people could experience displacement without movement, could lose and find themselves in the space between sleep and waking. The sleeping cars made this possible. George Pullman in America and Thomas Cook in Britain had perfected the art of converting railway carriages into mobile bedrooms. Seats folded into bunks. Curtains provided privacy. Porters moved silently through the cars, ensuring comfort, maintaining decorum, creating the illusion that one was not hurtling through darkness at 50 miles per hour, but resting peacefully in some luxurious hotel. But the illusion was imperfect. The motion penetrated dreams, turned them strange and restless. The whistle's wail echoed through sleep like the cry of some mechanical beast. Station stops jolted passengers awake, left them staring at unfamiliar platforms in the small hours, wondering where they were, how far they had come, how much further remained. And for those who couldn't sleep, who pressed faces to windows and peered into the darkness, the night journey revealed the railway's true nature. Not as a means of connection, but as a force of disruption, slicing through landscapes that had been settled for centuries, dividing the ancient from the modern with a line of steel. In the darkness, you could see things that daylight hid. The labor camps along new construction sites, their fires flickering like stars brought to earth. The faces of signalmen in their lonely boxes, waiting through the night to throw switches for trains that might not come. The ruins of mills and factories that had been bypassed by the railway, left to crumble while prosperity flowed elsewhere. The night journey was honest. It showed that progress was not universal, that the railway's benefits were selective, that for every winner there were losers left behind in the darkness. By 1880, night trains crisscrossed Europe and America. The Orient Express would soon begin its legendary run from Paris to Constantinople, promising luxury and adventure, delivering both along with the reminder that even the most elegant train was still just a machine, still vulnerable to derailment, collision, the thousand failures that could turn journey into catastrophe. Railway accidents at night were particularly horrific. In darkness, wreckage burned longer before help arrived. In darkness, injured passengers wandered away from crash sites, became lost, died from exposure or injuries that daylight might have made survivable. The Armagh Rail disaster in Ireland, June 1889, occurred in daylight, but revealed the consequences of night practices. An overloaded excursion train lost its brakes on a hill, rolled backward, and collided with a following train. 80 passengers died, most of them children. The investigation revealed that the railway company had been running unsafe practices for years, practices hidden by darkness and distance, by the assumption that what happened away from major stations didn't matter. The disaster forced Britain to mandate automatic brakes and better signalling, but it took 80 dead children to produce that change. This was the pattern of railway safety. Improvements came only after catastrophes, and catastrophes came with numbing regularity. For the workers who maintained the railways, night was not adventure but dread. Track maintenance happened at night, when trains were fewer, when crews could work without constantly dodging passenger services. Men walked the lines with lanterns, checking for loose bolts, cracked rails, undermined embankments. They worked in teams, usually pairs, talking to each other to stay alert, listening for the distant whistle that meant a train was approaching. Sometimes they didn't hear it in time. The wind was wrong, or they were concentrating on a difficult repair, or exhaustion had dulled their senses. The train would emerge from the darkness, its headlamp throwing shadows that made everything strange. There would. By 1880, the easy railways had been built. What remained were the impossible ones. The Canadian Pacific Railway, chartered in 1881 to span the 3,000 miles from Montreal to Vancouver, was not merely difficult. It was absurd. The route crossed the Canadian Shield, a wasteland of rock and muskeg that devoured equipment and men. It traversed the prairies, where winter temperatures dropped to 40 below zero and summer heat cracked rails. And finally, it confronted the Rocky Mountains, peaks that rose over 11,000 feet, ranges that had stopped every previous expedition. Parliament promised the railway would be completed in 10 years. Surveyors said it would take 20. Skeptics said it would never be finished at all. William Van Horn, the American railway manager brought in to oversee construction, was not interested in skepticism. He was 50 years old, 300 pounds of confidence and competence, a man who had built railways through the American West and believed nothing was truly impossible, merely expensive. He mobilized an army, 12,000 workers at the peak of construction, drawn from everywhere and nowhere. Chinese laborers recruited in Guangdong promised steady work and passage to the Gold Mountain. Scandinavian immigrants, experienced with cold and hardship. French Canadians, working on their own land for foreign capital. Irish and Scottish navvies, following the same trade that had brought them to railways in Britain and America. And indigenous peoples, displaced from their lands by treaties they had not understood, watching the railway slice through territories where their ancestors had lived for millennia, knowing that the Iron Road meant the end of everything they had known. The work in the mountains was unlike anything attempted before. Cliffs where there was no room to build a roadbed, rivers in gorges too deep to bridge economically, avalanche zones where spring snowmelt could bury entire construction camps, rock so hard that black powder barely scratched it. The Chinese workers drew the most dangerous assignments. They were lowered in baskets over cliff faces, hanging hundreds of feet above raging rivers, drilling holes for explosives. When the fuse was lit, they had 30 seconds to signal to be pulled up. If the rope broke, if the men above were slow, if the fuse burned faster than expected, they died. Hundreds did. The exact number was never recorded. The company paid Chinese workers half what it paid white workers and kept even less careful records of their deaths. When a Chinese laborer died, his body was burned and his ashes shipped back to China if his family could afford it. If not, he was buried in a shallow grave beside the track, marked only by stones that winter frost would soon dislodge. The white workers died too, but their deaths were documented, their families compensated, however meagerly. The racial arithmetic of the railway age was explicit. Some lives mattered more than others, and mattering was measured in pounds and dollars, in records kept or not kept, in grave marked or unmarked. In the winter of 1884, an avalanche struck a camp in Rogers Pass, burying 17 men under 20 feet of snow. Rescue parties dug for 3 days before abandoning the search. The bodies were not recovered until spring thaw, by which time the work had moved 50 miles further west, and no one remained who remembered the dead men's names. But the railway advanced. Van Horn drove his crews with relentless pressure, promising bonuses for speed, threatening replacement for delay. Track laying became a competition, with teams racing to see who could lay the most rail in a day. The record was 6 miles, achieved on a day when everything went perfectly: weather, terrain, supply, and human endurance. Most days were not perfect. Most days brought rain or cold or equipment failures. Most days, the workers moved forward by inches, blasting and digging and hauling, building a railway through landscape that actively resisted them. And on November 7th, 1885, at Craigielachi in the mountains of British Columbia, the last spike was driven. Donald Smith, the financier who had made the railway possible, swung the hammer. The spike was iron, not gold, because Van Horn believed ostentation was waste. Photographs were taken. Speeches were made. The Canadian Pacific Railway was complete. Canada now stretched from ocean to ocean, bound together by steel. The journey from Montreal to Vancouver, which had taken months by stagecoach and ship, now took 7 days by train. The nation that had been a collection of colonies was now unified, or so the politicians claimed. But the indigenous peoples watching from the hills knew differently. The railway had divided their lands, disrupted migration patterns of animals they depended on, brought settlers in numbers that made resistance futile. The steel that united Canada had severed connections older and deeper than any nation. The Sea Age. There is a photograph from 1914, taken at Victoria Station in London on a summer evening. The platform is crowded with soldiers boarding trains, heading to ports where ships will carry them to France, to Belgium, to the war that everyone believes will be over by Christmas. The soldiers are smiling. The crowds wave flags. The railway platform, that mundane space of daily commutes and weekend trips, has become a stage for patriotism, for adventure, for the belief that modern technology and martial spirit can achieve quick, decisive victory. The railways made this war possible, not just by moving troops to the front, though they did that with unprecedented efficiency, but by creating the conditions that made such a war inevitable, by connecting nations so thoroughly that economic competition became strategic rivalry, by making it possible to move millions of men and millions of tons of supplies, turning warfare from limited conflicts into industrial slaughter. The German war plan, the Schlieffen Plan, was fundamentally a railway timetable. It called for moving 2 million men through Belgium into France using precise scheduling, with different units boarding specific trains at specific times, all choreographed to achieve surprise and overwhelming force. When the plan failed, when the war bogged down into trench warfare, the railways adapted. They became supply lines, moving shells and food and replacement soldiers to fronts that consumed everything with insatiable appetite. A single division required 5 trains daily just for basic supplies. A major offensive required weeks of railway movements to position artillery, ammunition, and troops. The railways had been built to connect, to trade, to bring prosperity. In 1914, they brought death on an industrial scale. 4 years of war would kill 20 million people, and the railways would be essential infrastructure for that killing, moving men toward the guns, moving wounded back from the front, moving civilians away from advancing armies. This was the ultimate revelation of the railway age. Connection did not guarantee peace. Speed did not ensure wisdom. Technology was neutral, and neutral meant it served whoever controlled it, whatever they chose to do with it. After the war, after the maps had been redrawn and empires had fallen, the railways remained. But they were different somehow, tainted by what they had enabled. The railway stations that had once represented adventure now represented grief, filled with widows and mothers meeting trains that brought back the maimed and traumatized, the men who had left as boys and returned as ghosts. In Britain, the war memorials in every town and village listed the dead. Often, those dead had left from the local railway station, boarding trains on journeys that ended in Flanders mud. The railways had carried away a generation and brought back only memory. The railways had connected the world. This was undeniable. A person in 1920 could board a train in London and travel, with connections and ferry crossings, to India or China or South Africa. The network spanned continents, linked nations, created a global economy where goods and people moved with unprecedented freedom. But the world the railways connected was profoundly unequal. The same technology that allowed a British merchant to travel to Bombay in first-class luxury was used to move Indian cotton to British mills, where it was turned into cloth and shipped back to India, underselling local weavers, destroying indigenous industry, extracting wealth in the name of trade. The railways in colonial territories were not built to serve local populations. They were built to extract resources, to move raw materials to ports, to facilitate control. The stations were in cities where Europeans lived. The trains ran on schedules that suited export shipping. The pricing made railways inaccessible to most local people, who continued to walk or use bullock carts as they always had. In Africa, the railway stations were spaces of segregation. Separate waiting rooms for Europeans and Africans. Separate carriages. Different prices for the same journey. The physical infrastructure of connection became the architectural embodiment of division, a daily reminder that proximity did not mean equality. In America, the railways that had bound the nation together became instruments of racial segregation. Jim Crow laws mandated separate facilities, separate cars, separate spaces on platforms. A black traveler in the American South could ride the same train as a white traveler, but could not sit in the same carriage, eat in the same dining car, use the same waiting room. The Supreme Court, in Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, ruled that separate railway facilities were constitutional as long as they were equal, enshrining the doctrine of separate but equal that would poison American society for 60 years. The case concerned a railway car. The precedent would be used to justify segregation in every